Hello, Vincenzo, and hello, listeners and viewers. Welcome. We have a very exciting interview with Vincenzo Di Nicola, who is one of my actually good friends. Vincenzo is a psychiatrist. He is focused on children and adolescent psychiatry as well as family therapy. Vincenzo has innovated a number of very important ideas and concepts in the field of modern psychiatry. So we're here to learn about the crisis of psychiatry as well as some of its possible emancipatory directions. Most of us here, both through our podcast, Renaissance Vampires, as well as our study groups, look at the intersection of Lacanian psychoanalysis and Marxism, or psychoanalysis more broadly speaking. So Vincenzo's obviously worked a lot with Freud, a lot with Lacan, was actually trained by R.D. Laing, and has a origin point professionally and in terms of your training, as far as I understand, in at least what we call the anti-psychiatry movement, which I want to learn a little bit about. And of course, Vincenzo has a number of very significant institutional affiliations. He is full professor at the University of Montreal in their psychiatry department, as well as affiliations with George Washington University and many others. Vincenzo wrote an incredible book many years ago called A Stranger in the Family. So the idea of the family as an institution is of profound interest, as both biographically. He's written an incredible essay at Ion magazine about his own personal story with his father, which I encourage everyone to read. And Vincenzo and I formed our friendship through both being students of the French philosopher Alain Badiou. And Alain Badiou's thought has really opened up doors for Vincenzo to rethink the institution of psychiatry in the modern age. So first of all, welcome to the program. And would you start by just giving a little bit of an overview of your main areas of research, Vincenzo, for the benefit of listeners? I've tried to do my best, but I'm sure I neglected several aspects.
Well, you're very kind, Daniel. It's great to be with you again. I'm speaking to you from Montreal. We're in the middle of another wave of the pandemic, about which I think is actually very relevant to our concerns and maybe to what we want to talk about today, in that it creates a social context for how we think about everything. Historians have said that pandemics have a greater impact on society, transforming society, than even wars or revolution, which is quite a statement. So here I am. I have the institution affiliations referred to. A significant one is that I now am teaching in the global mental health faculty of the Harvard program in refugee trauma at Harvard Medical School. The affiliation is really with the program rather than the university or even the Department of Psychiatry of the medical school. I have colleagues and friends there, but it really is a very special program. And that is really the heart of the matter. Let me get at this from a personal perspective. So I was a full professor of psychiatry when we met, and I didn't tell people that. And I started my studies in philosophy. Now, why did I do that besides my love of philosophy since I was a teenager? I decided that I wasn't sure about what I was professing. And the crisis came about for me when I took the Harvard, when I was a student, as kind of a master's, a postgraduate program in the Harvard program in refugee trauma. And as I told Richard Malika, who was already a good friend, a colleague, and became my mentor in this field, I learned a lot, but I didn't feel like I understood much more. To put it differently, I didn't feel like we got to the bottom of things. So that every time we would try to dig deeper, there was all kinds of information, kind of collateral, horizontal information, but I didn't have a sense that we went more deeply. And that is in spite of many brilliant faculty members and Richard himself, who is a very unusual psychiatrist. He's, got a program at Harvard. As he said, when he dies, there'll be thousands of people at his funeral. These are Cambodian refugees. He's never closed a chart. He doesn't give diagnosis. He doesn't use medications. So a very unusual trauma-focused psychiatrist. We talk about trauma-informed therapy. So he's already a very unusual guy. He did a master's of religious arts at Yale. His book, Healing Invisible Wounds, was touted by no one less than the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu. I had this incredible reach, and in spite of this tremendously humanistic and non-medical approach, I still felt that we weren't really getting to the bottom of things. So, as you put it well, is when I met Alain Badiou, I was really looking around. I thought it was a lateral move. I thought, well, I'll just take some time off, think about things through a philosophical perspective. And there were many brilliant people at the European Graduate School. Giorgio Agamben, a former research assistant to Michel Foucault, Thomas Zoomer, Slavoj Žižek. But when I came across Alain Badiou, he had some notions that really appealed to me. And first of all, he's not a nihilist. He's a very constructive, in the ordinary sense of the word, thinker. He's a builder. He's not an anti-philosopher, or as the American humanist philosopher Richard Rorty said, he's not an edifying philosopher in the sense of just adding emballage, wrapping or digressions. The way I think many philosophers do. He's a Grundwerk. I mean, he's a kind of trying to build up from the ground kind of philosopher in the Platonist tradition, and that appealed to me. But above all, what appealed to me, he had this fundamental theory about the nature of being, ontology, and his belief, which is both philosophical and social, largely conceived, is that an event changes one's life, one being the subject, the individual. In fact, it creates a subject, but also in a larger sense for the world. It creates a new world. There's a rupture. And as soon as I heard him talk about this notion of a rupture, I thought back to my experiences in the Harvard program in refugee trauma. And not the people in the program necessarily, but the larger social discourse about trauma, notably in the Anglo-American world, was kind of trauma is almost a doorway into transcendence. And I found that troubling. And I began to play with this notion, trauma and event, inspired by Alain Badiou's notion of being an event. And when I approached him, he used to have two kind of blocks for meetings, 20-minute blocks or 40-minute blocks. And he's the kind of guy that he stops the lecture on the second that he planned it. I mean, he's a very, very organized thinker and disciplined person. Well, the 20 minutes morphed into an hour and a half because he was very taken by my notion. We communicated in French, this couplet, this coupling of trauma and event. And that just opened tremendous doors for me.
Yes. I think it was Wagner, although it's attributed obviously to Freud as well, but the wound is only healed by the spear that smote it. I wanted to ask you, obviously within Freud, you already have this dialectical thesis, which is paradoxical, obviously, in Freud's study of World War I veterans, that somehow the ones who were wounded, right, had a kind of more of a wherewithal for the working through of their trauma than those who were not directly wounded at their corporeal level, right? So, and then of course we have the contemporary conversation on trauma, which we could maybe invite you to say something about. There was recently an interesting essay, you don't need to comment on this essay, by Will Self in Harper's about the popularization and the political weaponization of trauma in ways which are very harmful to a number of things. For example, very harmful to creating solidarity across marginalized groups, very harmful to thinking the agency of the self or the subject, right? So how have we gotten trauma so wrong, and how might we restore a better conception of it?
Yeah, I think that's very opposite. I read, because of you, actually, I saw you citing him on your Twitter account. I looked it up. I usually look at Harper's anyway, but I looked up the essay. I think first of all, I agree with his animus. I mean, I agree with what animated him to contest this. I mean, Will Self was an interesting writer, and I was actually surprised at the quality of his scholarship. Let's throw the net a bit wider. So in my doctoral dissertation with Alain Badiou, I spoke to the age of trauma, but I don't mean that in a positive way, in the sense of here's something celebratory or laudatory or emancipatory, we're opening doors. Far from it. In the age of trauma, I think we're closing down doors, which is what I believe trauma does. My definition of trauma is very simple. Inspired by Badiou's, I'm standing on the shoulders of a giant, inspired by his notion. I think trauma shuts down possibilities and the event opens them up. That's the bottom line after 4 years with Alain Badiou and almost 500 pages of text. So I think that what he's saying is something that's very, very important. How did we get to the point where every human vicissitude, becomes traumatic? Let me tell you a story with just one small vulgarism in it. So I met someone that became a very dear friend at a family therapy meeting in Buenos Aires. So she was originally from Montreal, now living in Florida. And she was telling her personal story, a very typical story that she'd been married, she had a family, built a career in Florida and so on. And then she offhandedly referred to her trauma. I said, oh, really? What was that? She said, well, my divorce, of course. And I said, was it particularly horrific? I mean, what was going on? I mean, basically, she told a story that we've all heard many times in our own families, perhaps in ourselves, of a breakup that was painful and difficult interpersonally and with huge impacts, sometimes notably for women, especially, or whoever the major breadwinner is. It has terrible financial consequences, trying to sense of loneliness. I acknowledge all of that. And I said, but why is that a trauma? And she said, what do you want to call it? And I said, well, shit happens. I mean, why have we gotten in this age of trauma, which is what Will Self was talking about, to the point where everything that's bad that happens has to be a trauma, has to create victimhood, has to be necessarily something that is built into the cake, built into the human condition? Maybe it's not. Let me tell you another anecdote. My grandmother was born in 1910. She died at the age of 95, more than 15 years ago. She went through 2 world wars, fought in our backyard, not somewhere else where soldiers went. The troops were going through our backyard. She lived through an earthquake that leveled her town, that had a marking impact on everybody that lived through it, including a distant cousin of hers and mine, Ignazio Siloni, who was a famous leftist in Italy and wrote about the conditions of the Cafoni, the know-nothings, peasants of our area of Italy, central Italy, the Abruzzo. So he talked about having lived through this earthquake, which was truly a potential trauma. But my grandmother lived through that, the Spanish flu in 1918, the death of first her husband went off to war, then his death very young, just after the war, of stomach cancer, the death of 2 young children, and so on and so on. Would I say that she was traumatized? Did she ever act as if she was traumatized? No. Neither would I reach for resilience, which is another pet peeve of mine. Just like we don't all live through trauma, why do we need to invoke resilience? Many people have suggested that the very reason we invoke resilience, and it has many different meanings, I know. I've met Boris Cyrulnik and had this conversation with him. He's like Mr. Resilience. I understand that people want to reach for something transcendent about human beings, their tremendous resources. Of course, I hope for that and I hold for that. However, I believe that often the very notion of resilience, positive psychology, and so on, is really a kind of stopgap, a way to kind of fix the gaps and the errors in our thinking. I mean, if everything is trauma, but not everybody's traumatized, or not everybody is dysfunctional or somehow not working in their lives, then we have to invoke something else that says, well, yeah, this group of people, this child is resilient, in spite of the fact that this child, has these things going on. This child, does well in school, makes friends, and so on and so on. So it's like phlogiston, in 19th century physics. It was an invented notion to account for gaps in the theory. I think if that happens, we should abandon the theory. Now, trauma is real. There are people generally traumatized by my definition. In other words, life shuts down. But the minute we start calling every vicissitude, shit that happens, to be vulgar, things that are unpleasant, people don't necessarily, their lives don't necessarily shut down around that. And this goes to the heart of psychiatry's crises. The reason this keeps happening in psychiatry, in fields like trauma or depression or working with supposedly psychotic experience is we have these fundamental gaps. And since these gaps are not understood, digested, or resolved, they're like festering wounds that invite sealing over, a kind of healing over. And these healings over are often blind alleys, asymptotes, the law of diminishing return, or just, as Wittgenstein and other people in the analytic philosophical tradition call them, pseudo-problems. So we need to clean up the house of psychiatry of what Wittgenstein called pseudo-problems, blind alleys. In other words, the famous expression these days, going down the rabbit hole that doesn't really have any payoff, or an asymptote. I believe the DSM system, and I'm in the bosom of mainstream psychiatry. I'm not some outlier doing, stuff that we say in French is flyer, out there. I got my feet firmly planted. I'm strongly part of the APA, critical within it, but part of the APA. But we have this project that has its own logic, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which I understand its evolution, its logic. However, it's brought us to an asymptote. The further refinements of that system are not going to be worth, the game ain't going to be worth the candle. We're going to keep refining things. I've been at the table. I was actually on the oversight committee from the APA assembly of that research. I mean, I didn't have a lot of power. I just reported to the APA assembly about it. These are very sincere people, hardworking. They're fine scientists, but they almost can't afford to stop and look at the big picture. They do, by the way, but gently, gingerly, because I think if you do that, you start saying, well, what problem is this responding to? This need for classification. As my son jokes, who's an international lawyer, he says, Dad, get to work. There's 2 or 3 people on the planet that don't have a label yet. I think it's funny, and I think it's sadly true. Of course, it's a caricature, but the caricature, the system invites this caricature because people go along in this logic. And when it becomes absurd or exaggerated or unproductive, instead of sort of stopping the game and sort of saying, well, maybe we need to rethink this, people kind of, they go full speed ahead. So Alain Francis, is a very interesting anecdote. Alain Francis was the chairman of DSM-4. So we're now at DSM-5. The project started with DSM-1 in 1952, and then it keeps going. So it started with 100 pages, and now we're up to about 1,000 pages of small type in many, many categories. Alain Francis was the chairman of DSM-4. He became very critical of DSM-5, regardless of why. I mean, intellectually, the critiques were, we made mistakes in DSM-4, let's not repeat them and exaggerate them. And he became a critic of overdiagnosis and the need for, notably American society, the way the American medical system especially is constructed, to have all these diagnoses. Now, that's not true in Canada. It's not true in many countries where you have to have a diagnosis in order to be paid, in order for people to have certain status at work, or to be a refugee, and all these things. And I won't go so far as to say they're abuses. They're part of the logic of a given society's system. Now, my argument is, I understand the history very well. I'm part of it. But if we go deeper than simply explaining the historical context, we find that there's some important issues that have been left aside. The social determinants of health are more powerful data than anything biological we have. I'm not denying biology. I'm not denying genes.
So on that point, you have written a lot about social psychiatry.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, why, in your opinion, is the psychiatric movement and psychology more generally, what allergy or aversion do they have to social diagnostics, or to emphasizing the social as a relevant form of treatment or of causality of symptoms and things of this nature? One could point to the evolutionist basis, the biological basis, the turn to neuroscience, but perhaps this is the political rub, in a way, that there is a defense or an avoidance to take the social seriously. So why is that the case?
I think that's a first-class question. It's important to say that is extremely relevant today, but it's not relevant in every society and in every epoch. It is generally true. And I can give you a very specific example. I worked for many years, decades really, in the field of eating disorders. And so when you look at the history of, this is a kind of Foucauldian notion, right? Society looking at people that are suffering, and why do they have a certain status? Why do we give them names and so on? So that's a whole bunch of unpacking we need to do. But if we look at the history of eating disorders as they were constructed in medicine and eventually psychiatry and psychology, psychotherapy. So you have in 1868 in Oxford and independently in 1873 in Paris, William Gall and Charles Lassagne stand up, give a talk at learned societies, and people in the audience say, oh yeah, I have a case like that. Anorexia nervosa, anorexia hysterica, things like that. What's very interesting is, however much we want to criticize that gaze, that medical regard towards a certain condition that was affecting largely women, and every word in there is relevant and needs unpacking. That said, with all the vagaries that are associated with that, your point is well taken. What happens? So 1870s, a branch of research opens up. Psychiatry has already been going for more than 50 years. 1808, the word was coined, and it became the third branch of medicine. It was coined by a guy called R-E-I-L. Creates the third branch of medicine, the first two being surgery and pharmacy or therapeutics, it was called at the time. So internal medicine today, surgery. The third branch of medicine was not pediatrics, obstetrics, and so on, but psychiatry. So it was already present. And then people made a series of so-called discoveries, constructions, if you wish, depending on your view of the philosophy of science. So these guys create that. Tremendous research goes on, tremendous, reports in every language all around Europe on the social factors, and it's affecting women much more than men. It happens at a tender age, adolescence, or early adult life. It was an affliction of the middle and upper classes, such that when I started doing my research in anorexia nervosa, I saw it in working class girls, so-called, I would say these are working class girls with upper class pretensions. And there was some sense to that joke. The point is that we were using this as a tool, however much we want to criticize the use of such tools, a la Foucault and so on. But something eventually happens. So there's a tremendous tradition, tremendously rich vein of research going on in theorizing about the role of women in society as well. All kinds of interesting comments early on. At the time of the suffragette movement. Fascinating. So 1914, a guy called Morris Simmons comes along in Germany and discovers Simmons disease, which is related to a pathology of the pituitary. And Simmons disease gives anorexia in the literal sense of the Greek word, like lack of appetite, no appetite, like cancer does, like depression does, like anemia does. Many medical conditions do that. But suddenly they had a medical explanation for a psychological, an emerging notion of what psychology meant, what the mind meant, including Freud's tremendous influence. So these other aspects of human being than the purely physiological, pathophysiological. So they immediately shifted their gaze, not everybody, but the tendency was towards understanding this new thing called anorexia nervosa. Oh, maybe it's not nervosa after all. Maybe it's not really to the mind or the nervous system, but to something else, like it's something in the pituitary. Makes things worse, in 1939, Sheehan describes postpartum pituitary necrosis. So women after giving birth have a necrosis, a kind of dying of cells in the pituitary. And again, it gave anorexia, lack of appetite, weight loss, and so on, with a kind of special affect that was related to look like depression and so on. So long story short, whenever we have supposedly medical, in the narrowest sense of the term, explanations based on pathophysiology that you can demonstrate in the brain and the body, not in the soul, not in the mind, not in the interpersonal space, not in the commons, to use a leftist phrase, people privilege that over others. Why? It's simple. It's not as hard to understand. And there is a kind of implicit, sometimes soft, sometimes hard prejudice against the social, the interpersonal, the relational, the social, what we call today the social determinants of health. So that's a very, very example of how in medicine, in the history of medicine, we tend to privilege biological, narrowly defined explanations over social psychological explanations, even if they're largely defined. Now, to anticipate the heart of my critique and where I stand in medicine and psychiatry is, I don't think we should eliminate the medical model, but I kept saying, narrowly defined biological factors, narrowly defined medicine or pathophysiology. My argument is we can't get rid of the body. We can't get rid of what we do know about this aspect of human being, but we think we should expand what we mean by medical. Medical in all areas of medicine, not just in psychiatry or public health, should include the social determinants of health. As I said before, these data are more powerful, more durable, more easy to demonstrate than even the pathophysiology and the genetics for now.
Yeah.
In psychiatry. So you're absolutely right. We tend to privilege what can be described as reductive. And we live in an age of scientism. And we live in an age, as Raymond Tallis, who was a noted researcher in geriatrics, and when he retired, he started writing about philosophy and many other things. He wrote a very important book called Aping Mankind. And he talked about Darwinitis and neuromania. We're living in an era of Darwinitis and neuromania. So my friend Thinker, with whom I trained at McGill and has been a lifelong friend, would argue for evolutionary psychology. I think that's very interesting. We have built-in adaptive mechanisms that explain a lot of things. For example, my snake phobia. I suffered from a snake phobia as a young man. I was treated for it. And part of the answer is not just my personal experience, but that we have this built-in. No one's afraid of rabbits. No one's afraid of tigers. I go to Brazil. I could be wandering into the Pantanal or someplace that's still got a degree of wildlife. I'm not afraid of meeting tigers, although you need to be very respectful of tigers. I'm afraid of meeting snakes. So there's a built-in evolutionary advantage to be having certain fears. We know that. But my snake phobia, which is what took me to R.D. Laing, was much more complex than my learning history or the preparedness for that kind of phobia. It had symbolic meaning. It had resonances in me as a person and in the societies I lived in, and the meaning of snakes in our society. And that's what a more narrow vision can't grasp. And after all, of course, there's biology, of course, there's genetics and neuromechanism, but the whole point of civilization or society or culture, these are three different terms in different societies that express the same thing. And by the way, we'll self-talked about that. Of course, these different things, society, culture, civilization, whatever you want to call it, the whole point of coming together as a society is that meaning accrues, rituals accrue, traditions accrue that go beyond the narrow reality of biology and evolution in our brains. And that is what this moment in history is doing to my field, whether it's psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy, all the side disciplines are being embêtés, as we say, stupefied by this romance around genes and brains.
Yeah, I want to ask, it's very rare for in today's time, and or maybe it's not, to see an institution like psychiatry, which because of the profound educational stakes involved with becoming a psychiatrist, and then the profound power that is granted to psychiatrists way, way beyond what a psychologist or a counselor or even a psychoanalyst is capable of doing, precisely because of the use of medicine. One would think at a certain point that therefore this institution of psychiatry is more rigid, more impervious to radical changes. And I want to know if that's true. And I also want to invite you to talk a little bit about what a lot of our listeners will be familiar with, which is the tradition of anti-psychiatry.
Sure.
How did that come about? What exactly is it? And are its effects or its residues still permeating psychiatry today?
I love the question. And I have a meta comment. I mean, I want to answer the question, but the meta comment is, it's very interesting. See, coming from a different perspective as you have, and you have your foot in a side discipline through Lacan, and through many of the people that we mutually respect, and from Jacques to Badiou, who all have studied Lacan deeply and closely. I remember Alain Badiou telling me he had met Lacan and had conversations with him, as did, of course, Jacques and others. So the meta comment is, your question is so well historically situated and so respectful. Sometimes people who criticize psychiatry don't seem to know very much about it, and then we get into like fruitless conversations, where the psychiatrists or people that are trying to defend their tradition become defensive, and it becomes a kind of futile discussion. But I think the way you're framing it is very good. First of all, many leading psychiatrists have said for a long time, certainly for the last 100 years, that as R.D. Laing said, some of the severest critics of psychiatry are psychiatrists themselves. And I think that's very, very important. Again, let's go back. The term was created in 1808 in a German-speaking city by this guy called Christian Reil, R-E-I-L. And we've had this tradition in medicine ever since. It's constantly shifting. And some people would argue it's always been in crisis. From day one, there were critics. I mean, is this really part of medicine, the way surgery is, the way, internal medicine has become, and so on and so on? Well, I think that's true. I think it is founded on a complex epistemic basis. I mean, what Ronnie Laing said was, psychiatry is founded on a false epistemology. The idea being, he trained in England, Scotland, in Great Britain, where at the time, psychiatry was largely, I wouldn't say biological, it wouldn't be fair to the tradition, but it was largely, solidly a branch of medicine with many sophisticated elaborations. Okay, I mean, the history of psychiatry in Britain is a very, very interesting topic in itself. So he's in that tradition. What does he say? He says, the false epistemic basis of psychiatry is that it has a biological theory, but a social treatment. This is a very profound point that's very rarely well taken. So he himself was trained in classical medicine, psychiatry, then psychoanalysis, spoke very honestly and openly about his own experiences within his family, and his effort to treat the most severely mentally ill, at least in the way we understand it or understood it to that point. And he had the great courage to try to open up the discourse. So the problem is, how do you add social, psychological, dare we say even, cosmo, I mean, how do we add a larger context? How do we expand the frame of psychiatry and at the same time not be untrue to its base? My answer to that, and that's why I've stayed in the institution, or I'm battling within the institution, if you wish, is I think we need to undo that first bias. In other words, yes, it's biological, but biology needs to be understood very, very widely. And that's not only doctors or anti-psychiatrists, but biologists have said that. If you look at C.H. Waddington, Peter, who created, in many ways, the modern notion of genetics with powerful metaphors, about, genetics is like a rock rolling down a mountain, and it'll follow the natural crevices, and that's where the water will then flow along. I mean, really lovely metaphors that grasp the interaction between environment and genetics. And today we have epigenetics. Peter Medawar, who was very critical of psychoanalysis, but was a brilliant immunologist. He had fantastic notions, the self, the non-self. So actually biology is much more sophisticated than medicine has received it sometimes. And certainly psychiatry has received it in a kind of reductive way. So my argument would be, my response to Laing would be, let's open up what we mean by biology so that it doesn't become a paradox of why we see something in biological terms in terms of its causation, but the treatment is social. And by the way, even if it was purely biological in this more reductive way, there's nothing wrong with looking at migraines or diabetes or any chronic disease, chronic pain, and say, yes, the origin is organic in this narrow way. But the answer might be in behavior. The answer might be in attitudes. The answer might be in the way you're looking at life.
And that's a wonderful segue to the very fascinating dynamic of the diagnosis of ADHD in children. If you look at compared to Europe, especially France, compared to the United States, the contrast is striking in the sense that, so I'd love your actually thoughts on that as someone who is dealing with children, myself, and I think many others are dealing with young children, and this ADHD, this kind of over prescriptive tendency on behalf of psychiatrists. Does that create a real damage? And why is this going on? What is the story there in your view?
Well, the story is a complicated one. I mean, it's very interesting that you invoke Frantz. So you know, I have a foot in several traditions, and I was sort of Italian, raised in North America, you know, trained at McGill in psychology, then later graduate school in England, where I was exposed even more powerfully to the psychiatric tradition, because my training was always in psychiatric institutes. Very interesting. Although I was a psychologist, I trained in psychiatric institutes. So a lot of my interlocutors, a lot of my teachers were actually very open-minded, pioneering social psychiatrists and others. So it's very interesting. So in the Anglo-American tradition, they will say that France just doesn't get it. I mean, that they're still lost. This would be, quite frankly, the way they would look at it. They won't say this in public, but I'll say it. They'll say, well, you know, France is still stuck in the psychoanalytic tradition. They're still thinking about development and asking questions about children's attention based on other factors. Now, that's very interesting. So there's attention not only in terms of the number of diagnoses and the way people respond to a given diagnosis, a given construction of a child's problem, but so there's a whole social context of how people came to that question. So my mentor, when I did my fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry, was what I called Jovan Simion, who was from the former Yugoslavia, had trained in France, had done studies all over the world, and I was with him here in Canada. He started a very interesting study that he was part of, that looked at Switzerland. So Switzerland is a country of cantons with different cultural and linguistic traditions, at least 4. There's other tiny pockets, you know, Italian, Romansh, French, and German, as you know. So they did a study looking at precisely child psychiatry, and notably ADHD in Switzerland. And so if you ask the child psychiatrist in Ticino, Tessin in French, you know, the Italian canton, they had one answer, in the French canton, another one in German. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is the Italians look to Italy, the French, the Francophones look to France, and the German-speaking psychiatrists look to Germany. So people refer to their authorities. I remember Avital Ronel saying, you know, what are your authorities? You know, and many people say that, you know, Slavoj Žižek, when he would meet you, he said, you know, what are your authorities? Who do you refer to? It's a great question. So the authorities people have determine very greatly what they pay attention to. If you talk to senior psychiatrists who've been around, they learn, well, the world is not my little corner of the world here, in whether it's Switzerland, France, or Canada, or whatever. So that's part of the answer. So part of the answer is people are part of a tradition. And stepping out of a tradition comes at a cost. I mean, you can't easily be working in Washington, D.C. and say, you know what, I'm going to follow the phenomenological tradition of, you know, Eugene Minkowski, and we're going to refound psychiatry. Well, if you have a lot of social power and you're very charismatic and so on, you might do that. But that would be a huge undertaking. So most of us are part of a tradition. I think that's true in every human domain. So is there any truth underlies that? Well, when Alan Francis, to go back to the guy that was the chair of DSM-4, came to Montreal on the eve of the launching of DSM-5, he came to the University of Montreal, and I was asked to debate him. And you know, I read his stuff, and I looked at the DSM, the 5th version, and I said to the chairman of the department, I said, we're not going to have a very big debate because I largely agree with him. So we had this wonderful, we staged this wonderful debate, you know, with lots of sparks. And the bottom line, I agreed with him. And he said, diagnoses are overused in 3 main areas in child psychiatry. This was 2013. He said, ADHD, bipolar disorder in youth, and autism. Now, what's the truth? Were people in the closet before? There's a lot of truths here, Daniel. It is true that in my lifetime, you know, and I'm in my 60s, in every generation or every 5 to 10 years, child psychiatry has simply aped adult psychiatry and said, gee, you know, adults have bipolar disorder, maybe kids do too. And you know what? It's true that some of those kids were in the closet. In other words, they weren't recognized. But we've gone overboard with bipolar disorder in children, which was ignored, or people were reluctant to call it that. What happened is the diagnosis of bipolar disorder in children grew 40 times, not 40%. That means 4,000%. And it's because of the research of people like Joe Biederman at Harvard. Now, Joe Biederman was a brilliant researcher, but by taking money that's associated with drug companies who have an interest in promoting more diagnosis because it creates greater markets for them, more children were exposed, more children were diagnosed, more children were given medications. And as a result, if the medication was not necessary or not effective, they were being exposed to the side effects of medication and the social effects of taking a medication, which cannot be minimized. In other words, I'm very, very sensitive to what my patients tell me all the time. I work with kids, and sometimes, when they're 5, when they're 10, they're willing to take the medications that their parents agree with. And I go through tremendous lengths to explain, and we do psychoeducation groups to bring them up to speed to answer their questions. But when they're like 13, 14, 15, 16, when they're adolescents, they start saying, well, they don't like the very idea of being ill. They don't like the very idea of being dependent on the medication. And then, of course, I answer, well, it's not a dependence in the sense that you mean it, but maybe psychologically it is a kind of dependence. So when they're asserting their identity, they start feeling badly about it. So that's what I call like the side effects and the collateral damage around giving a medication, even beyond the biology. The very notion of giving a label, especially if it's wrong, the very notion of giving an intervention, especially when it bypasses will, is very, very serious. So I take position serious. And you know what? The majority of my colleagues do too. However, it's very hard to step outside the logic. So ADHD, are these medications overprescribed? I have a nuanced answer. They're perhaps badly prescribed. I do think there's such a thing called ADHD. I also think that ADHD is overused as an explanation for children that are oppositional because of their nature or of the way their nature has come to be constructed, co-constructed with their parenting and so on. Simple exuberance. I mean, there are children just more exuberant than others. We shouldn't label everything as ADHD. So I give a talk called All That Bounces Is Not ADHD, but all that's distracted is not ADHD. So I do think there's a real thing there. I think this thing, whatever it is complex. And I think one of the more interesting projects of psychiatry today is to go from a symptom-based approach. The NIMH went to a brain-based approach. What's happening in the brain. I think that's too limited. And it bore no fruit. I mean, as Alain Badiou says, gives you all these pretty images, in color MRIs, but what does it really say? It says interesting things on a neuroscience level, but it translates with great difficulty to clinical psychology, psychiatry, or therapy. So I have a very nuanced approach. I do think there's something called ADHD. I think there are many, many subtypes, and there are many, many different ways to skin this particular cat, not only with medications. The truth is, it's not the doctors, not in my experience, that are flogging medications. The kids come and say, I don't know, I didn't believe it at first, but the parents say, the teacher says this kid has ADHD and not to bring him back until he gets a medication. I thought they're surely lying or exaggerating and misunderstood. And I will talk to the schools because I'm a community psychiatrist. I talk to the schools. And they kind of sheepishly admit, yeah, they did see something like that. So it's not just that psychiatry has its own sins. Also, the society puts us in a position where, the kid's not doing well at school, the parents can't handle the kid's behavior, give a medication. This is not just psychiatrist's problem, it's society's problem that always looks for quick fixes. Yeah. So I don't like the social power I have. I don't like writing certificates for school. Kids come to see me, they're going through this pandemic. I understand that I have social power, but they want me to write a retrospective justification saying they didn't do the exam, they didn't do their homework because of COVID. And I'm looking at them and saying, yeah, but is that real? And let me tell you, Daniel, it's very, very hard for me not to use that power, because if I don't use it, they'll go to another doctor for one thing. So I try to be balanced, but I don't want to be defensive, but I think psychiatrists don't come from another planet. We're formed within a society, and to try to step outside of that, as I try to do, or at least nuance it, requires a tremendous amount of conviction and clarity. And so because of my age, because of my status, I can be more convincing than a younger psychiatrist maybe. Right. Even there's tremendous limits. In other words, there's a social logic that goes with the construction of a profession, and it's very difficult to have what Alain Badiou challenged me to create, an evento psychiatry that steps outside of that tradition. Maybe if I was 20 years younger, I would do it, but I'm trying to do it anyway. But I'm not sure that it can be done within the system. I think that a rupture, which is what it would be, would necessitate stepping outside the tradition, which is what Laing did.
Yep.
Let's go to anti-psychiatry. So the 4 anti-psychiatrists I studied, because I chose psychiatrists whose mother tongue I could read. So I chose Franco Basaglia in Italy, Jacques Lacan in France, Frantz Fanon from the Caribbean and later, France and Algeria, and Laing. So I could read those 3 languages and I had access to them, so I couldn't be accused of not understanding them. So what's interesting is they were all classically trained doctors and psychiatrists, most of them also psychoanalysis, most of them also in the rich tradition of phenomenological psychiatry and phenomenology itself. I mean, Laing actually met Sartre and wrote a whole book with David Cooper on 10 years of Sartre's philosophy, and for which Sartre wrote the preface. So these are people that were solid traditional psychiatrists that all chose in one way or another to negate some part of psychiatry. I call it psychiatry against itself rather than anti-psychiatry, which I think more powerful because it came from within. So each one negated some fundamental aspect of either the theory and or the practice and the social implementation of psychiatry. So Franco Basaglia was a reformer. He trained in psychoanalysis, phenomenological psychiatry, and philosophy. You can see it in his writings. He wrote in Italian and French. Wonderful writing, wonderful phenomenological essays, very deeply informed. And then he became the head of a large asylum in northern Italy, in Gorizia. And he became radicalized because he thought the way that people were treated was unhelpful. And it's not about motives. It's about, again, institutional logic. So he actually went into politics with the Radical Party, passed a law, which was paradoxically called the 180, number 180, which was a 180-degree turn away from the logic of the asylum. And this reform created a tremendous crisis in Italy. And this crisis created the family therapy movement in Italy. And the family therapy movement at the time was emancipatory, because what they did was the psychiatrists that had trained in that stepped outside the medical schools, stepped outside the hospitals, and created what didn't exist in Italy before. First of all, they created general hospital units of psychiatry in hospitals before we only had. In 1950, your recourse as an Italian was, if you had money, go to Switzerland, and if you didn't, you would go to an asylum where you were warehoused. And then, maybe psychoanalysis in the more sophisticated towns, Rome, Milano, Torino. So they created a crisis and an opening in the society. That's Franco Basaglia's work. And I trained in Milan with the people that inherited those psychiatrists that felt alienated from it. They were young Marxist psychiatrists. They felt alienated from the system, and they went to family therapy rather than psychoanalysis because it had a radical social agenda to understand mental alienation, relational problems, family issues from a more radical, wider social perspective, as opposed to a narrower biological or even psychoanalytic one, which emphasized in their reading the individual. Very, very interesting. So that's Franco Basaglia. Sorry, we could tell the story of all 4 of them. But, Basaglia was a reformer. Lacan was a radical. I'm sorry, Lacan is a rebel. I think Laing is the true radical. And I think that Frantz Fanon was a revolutionary. Literally, I mean, he took part in the Algerian Revolution. So each of them denied or countered some fundamental aspect of the theory and the practice of psychiatry. Let me just say one last thing about Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon died very young, in his 50s, of cancer. His project was, as we say in French, inachevé. It was incomplete. It wasn't realized fully. But he did nothing. His ambition was nothing less than to undermine the universality of a European or Western or Northern Hemisphere-based view of human beings. So he basically put into question the universality of the reigning notion of the person and wanted to create a larger context. And I think his project was incomplete and to some extent deviated into revolutionary politics. But I think we need to go back to Frantz Fanon's project, which I think cultural psychiatry has done, social psychiatry has done, to ask the question, that you asked me, what is emancipatory about psychiatry? Part of the emancipation of psychiatry is to not completely reject a tradition, but to enhance it so that other factors become salient: the social context, the cultural context, the history of the working class, and so on. I think this project is there, depending on what psychiatrist and what tradition and what time you're talking to, but it's not unified. And that's one of my major critiques of psychiatry today. It's very rich in ideas. You can find a psychiatrist that will agree with anything, but it's what we don't have is a consensual model that drives the field, except this reductive age of Darwinitis and neuromania.
Fascinating tour de force, Vincenzo. Thank you for that. One follow-up from it. Laing is more transformative than Lacan. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Why do you think that?
Yeah, just is institutional impact, is that, yeah, to say just a little bit more about that, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, Laing was a very interesting guy. I first saw Laing here in Montreal when I was a student in psychology. So I'm not a rabble rouser, you know. I mean, I'm 68, but I mean, even at 18, you know, I wasn't a rabble rouser. I don't think I ever went to a manifestation, you know, a demonstration on the streets with placards and so on. It's never was my style. I always read and associated with people like that. I mean, I'll tell you a secret that we shouldn't tell anybody. When I lived in London, I was hanging out in Irish pubs, you know, and supposedly meeting once in a while people from Sinn Féin, you know, but I really, you know, I mean, there was no difference between them and the IRA. And it was very, very tempting to me. I was also hanging out with Italians from Italy, and very, very seduced by not necessarily the movement itself, but the ideology or the critiques of the Red Brigades. So, you know, I was always attracted to these critiques of society, even if eventually I would reject them as, you know, overly violent or, you know, unreasonable. You know, I really turned against the Sinn Féin and the IRA because of violence, and what embittered me and many of my generation of Italians against at least part of the left. I consider myself a son of the left, literally. My father was of the left, because of the Red Brigades and the death of Aldo Moro. And another small story, I happened to be very good friends in London with a very well-known pediatrician from Naples, whose mother was the private secretary, literally, of Aldo Moro. And when she came to London after his assassination, I wasn't as busy as he was. He was completing his thesis, and I took her around London. We had many long conversations. So the violence of radical groups turned me off, and I think they're not compatible with my mission as a physician. But I've always been attracted to that. Why do I think Laing was had a huge influence? First of all, he's very charismatic. He wanted to open up psychiatry. He did not like the term. He said so in public. I heard him, and I heard it in private. He's not an anti-psychiatrist. I think he might have preferred the term radical. He argued for social phenomenology, and my thinking has come around more and more to what he was after. In other words, to understand the way being is constructed in human beings on a social level. He really was part of the family therapy movement, although he actually didn't do family therapy. He actually, like Murray Bowen in DC, where you're sitting, Murray Bowen would see individuals and talk about their families. To my knowledge, I don't think Laing was talking to families as such, but he was talking to individuals about their families, and notably looking at what we would call today the toxic effects of family interactions. You know, then the positive psychology movement, all that, you know, went against that kind of thinking. And many people criticized family approaches and the work of Laing for being too harsh and mother blaming and so on. Yes, I think these nuances matter, but I think he had a fundamental radical insight that say, look, the sources of our misery are not just biological. The sources of our misery are not only unconscious things that take years to unpack. And, you know, he trained at the Tavistock Institute, and his major the person that signed off on whether he could be an analyst or not was John Bowlby, you know, mainstream analyst of tremendous impact. So he classical training in medicine, psychiatry, psychoanalysis at the TAVI in London, one of the best places in the world, still is. And yet he had the courage to confront to open up psychiatry. If you read him today, he doesn't sound radical at all. I mean, forget the later stuff. I mean, the early books, you know, the divided self and others. This work is brilliant. I mean, and he's talking about real life cases, sometimes disguised stories of his own family. And they're all believable. So I think he had influence because I believe that to surpass a tradition, you have to be a master of that tradition. This is the journey I followed, you know. So I was a psychologist, critical of psychiatry, so I became a psychiatrist. I love philosophy, but I was very interested in politics and psychology, so I went into those areas, notably psychology. I think that you have to master the tradition in order to have an influence within it. All four of these people had mastered their tradition, there's no doubt about it, and yet in mastering it became very, very critical, certainly suspicious, and ultimately launched a devastating critique. I think that Laing was more, first of all, he outlived Fanon. Laing stayed within the tradition. I mean, he went into private practice as opposed to practicing in a hospital or at the TAVI. But I think that he put it out there. He spoke to the public, and that's a very big difference between our time today and the time of the 60s, 70s. You know, when I met Laing and, you know, and had my analysis with him, the very big difference is psychiatrists, even the critical psychiatrists, had a public voice. Right. I think the voice has shifted outside the profession. I don't know any psychiatrist today that's alive. I know Norman Sartorius, okay? It's hard to beat Norman Sartorius' credentials. He was the first director of the World Mental Health Organization's division of mental health division. He was head of the World Psychiatric Association and so on and so on and so on. He has a PhD in psychology. I don't think the average person has ever heard of Norman Sartorius. Everybody in my generation had heard of R.D. Laing, and I think that's why he had such an impact. He was charismatic, he wrote well, he told stories that seized people, which is a very, very big problem today. In the whole family therapy movement, in today's psychoanalysis, there are no more famous cases that the average person can wrap their mind around. There's no Anna O, there's no Rat Man, Wolf Man. Right. Except for people like Oliver Sacks, you know, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. It's very unusual that in psychiatry, people have that narrative brilliance to make these issues come alive in stories that are true, believable, and grasp some aspect of the public discourse. That's a really big problem. And I think Laing did that better than the other four, than the other three. Yeah.
I totally see that. And of course, I'm thinking here of Russell Jacoby's incredible historical sociological work on the death of the public intellectual, and particularly the death of the leftist public intellectual, because there was a time when, you know, you had soapbox in the streets before television, and the intellectual was not only a moral voice, but was an arbiter of discourse. And things have changed very radically. But, you know, something like a holistic or kind of transdisciplinary psychiatrist should be a public intellectual today, precisely because of all of the crises that we are dealing with. I mean, for example, the opioid epidemic. Now, the majority of the prescriptions of opioids to these people in the kind of former Rust Belt industrial, what was the industrial working class of America, they're now addicted to opioids. It gets no press time, it gets no mention in the media, it gets no mention in the discourse, but these people are dying. It's one of the #1 causes of death amongst people ages 15 through 45, right?
Yeah, more people died of that than of COVID.
More people have died. So, but it's a silent epidemic. I mean, Bernie Sanders is the only figure to even mention it. The commentariat, the ruling class doesn't want it to be a story. There's no nonprofits, or very few, that do anything about it. So, you know, but then look at the interesting fact there, that anybody who fought in Iraq War, either Iraq War I or Iraq War II, can say, I have PTSD and I'm going to get the opioids, right? And they do, right? And that's very interesting. Also, the diagnosis of PTSD from Vietnam, which was
invented for the Vietnam veterans coming back.
Yeah, but now it's so unclear to me. So if there is a traumatic event in one's family, in one's life, immediately a priori they are victims of PTSD. So I mean, I know that is also real. Like, you know, we were talking about ADHD. This is also real, but it seems that the incentive of the pharmaceutical industry in the context of a privatized healthcare system, like in the US, has just reaped is just a disaster, right?
I agree with you.
So I wonder what you think about that. I mean, why aren't we seeing breakaway psychiatrists who have the authority from their credentials and so on to speak to the social suffering and social ills that people are really facing, which only a psychiatrist could really speak to? And I think the opioid overdose is a great example of that. What do you think?
Again, I mean, the meta comment is, I think the way the question is couched is sophisticated and truer and more likely to get an interesting and valuable response than, you know, painting doctors, you know, as somehow terrible. Look, the Sackler family that was very big behind, you know, the fentanyl crisis is trying hard not to go bankrupt. And, you know, their name is being removed from medical schools and from institutions because of their probable knowing involvement in this. I mean, I remember very clearly, I'm old enough to remember when people were saying things, you know, why are we demonizing heroin and all these things? You know, it's not so bad. They did the propaganda that prepared the society to accept it. So there's that. And that's a genuine piece of the puzzle. I think the larger question you're asking is, why doesn't this come to our attention? Is, well, we live in a capitalist society where, you know, follow the money, right? I mean, whether it's Jerry Maguire with Tom Cruise, you know, looking at sports, or whether it's, you know, the Watergate, follow the money. I think unfortunately, it's not true of everybody, and it's not true of all societies, but I think, you know, as Bob Dylan says, money doesn't talk, it swears, and it's swearing to us a lot. So it's very hard to break the mold, to step outside. I don't want to justify anything. That's not my area of expertise, even though my department has fused, the Department of Psychiatry has fused with a group of neuroscientists working on addictions here. I train in that area, but I don't do a lot of work in that, so that it's not my particular mission, but I'm very sensitive to it for the reasons you said. It's not only the capitalistic frame and who's making money off of this, which is not negligible, but it's also the fact that notably the Democrats, I mean, the people that were supposed to be committed to the working class and to the poor, abandon these people for reasons that you as an American, and although I work in the United States, I think you will understand better. I mean, there's very complicated reasons how the Democratic Party came to abandon that, which is why it created a mandate and opening for the Republicans and for Trump. And rather than demonizing these people and saying what Hillary Clinton said, which was the worst political malpractice of a generation, and decrying these people as deplorable, which is just wrong. I mean, it's humanly wrong. Instead of saying, well, how can we reach out to these people? Why have we lost them as a constituency? You know, what is their plaint? What is their suffering about? It was just horrible on a human level, and political malpractice for her to do that. And she just opened the door for this other movement to follow in. Now, I happen to believe, against every American friend I have, that not every Republican is a demon. I don't think we should demonize political parties. I think we should be pragmatic and work with them and try to find ways in which, since they have the ear of this part of the population, how can we work together to reach them? I don't hear literally anybody, even on Fox. I mean, I listen, you know, out of self-preservation to all kinds of news outlets. I don't hear anybody arguing for reaching out. Everybody says, you know, we need to get beyond. But we don't. I mean, notably in the Anglo-American world, people do not try to reach across the divides. There was a time, you know, when Jack Kennedy was in hospital, Nixon went to visit him at the hospital. That wouldn't happen today. So even these people that have been demonized or mythologized, I mean, we're able to talk to each other. Right. What's happened in our society where opposing camps become opposing, can't talk to each other, and demonize their own constituencies? That's wrong. As it happens, you and I share a profound commitment to the working class. Look, I learned my Marxism on the shop floor. I grew up in a working class town, much like Pittsburgh, United States, Hamilton, Ontario. You know, we had the steel company, Dominion Glass. Everybody I know, their father worked at a big company. I didn't. I grew up in the working class, and that died. Those jobs aren't there anymore. And
Right.
Hamilton overcame it because it's near Toronto, and we have a major university, there's other employment, but there was people caught in there as well, not
Yeah.
as much as in the American Rust Belt. And that's a dirty story that needs to be told.
Right.
It can't
Right.
only be Bernie Sanders flogging that story.
Right. Well, a lot of people like, Slavoj Žižek and others have made an interesting comment, and they say, look, if you're going to raise, working class consciousness today, you got to keep in mind a couple of things. First is neoliberalism. The neoliberal era started in about 79, once it was fully implemented with Thatcher and Reagan, has been premised on the eradication of the working class as a category of social life, but also as a possible consciousness. And so, now we have a kind of culture war. We have a kind of ethnic and racial identitarianism, which is put front and center, and people use that and they abuse it, and that's obvious. However, one thing Zizek says is we need to not encourage the working class to identify with themselves as that particularly. And that's an interesting point. I wonder what you think about that, in the sense that because class consciousness is so absent or non-existent, people don't see their social relations in terms of that logic. They don't even see it. Exactly. So then there's a certain people fear, even from your generation, they fear that, well, what happens? Do we all become Stalinists if we push this idea? And I wonder what you think about that, because a lot of people will say, like, you got to be careful, what would happen? Because, you've seen moments of history where class warfare results in great violence and great purges. And I respond to that by saying, well, what are we going to do? Why don't we at least try out something to build a cohesiveness, to build a consciousness that's grounded in reality, right? Because we do still live in a class system, right? We're not all free entrepreneurs that can just do whatever we want. That's not how it is. That's how we're told how it is. That's what we're told. But people need to be alert. And so I wonder what you think about this prospect, because class consciousness, for my lifetime, I was born right when neoliberalism started. So I've never known anything other than that. If anything, all we've been trying to do is to build something. And we've been failing. I mean, we're trying, but then to hear a philosopher come and say, well, wait a second, be careful. What would you say to this when it comes to building kind of a sense of class consciousness amongst the working class? What would you say?
I think these are great questions. I was born before that. Of course, I was born in 1953. My Italian roots are very powerful. Not only symbolically in terms of historical memory, but I actually went back, trained in Italy. I have a teaching post in Italy, and I'm very nourished by the Italian political and philosophical tradition. By the way, I mean, not just because of Giorgio Agamben, but Roberto Esposito and many others. So that continues to nourish me. But in terms of my being raised in North America, I went through that, and I went through the great, as you say in French, deception, great disappointment of Reagan, Mulroney in Canada, Thatcher, and I've lived in all three societies. I know them intimately. And I wrote recently, I the title of one of my essays in response to a series of commentaries on my social psychiatry manifesto was called "There's No Such Thing as Society," I quoted ironically. I mean, Thatcher wanted to do no less than to deny society as a force. I mean, she was not a stupid person. She wasn't saying collectives don't exist. She was saying, no, to the extent that collectives exist, you should be responsible. Look to your family. Look to the opposite of Jack Kennedy's message. Don't ask what America can do for you. Ask what we together can do for the world, kind of stuff. She's saying, don't ask the government to do something for you. Get to work. Work. Use volunteer. I remember Reagan's reaching out to volunteers in the United States. Do your community stuff. Take care of your own family. Create jobs and so on. This was considered by them emancipatory and taking people away from the shackles of socialism and so on. The problem is that it's dishonest. There was a few intellectuals that actually believed it, but a lot, and economists, but a lot of people actually knew very well what they were doing, and they were taking money away from government-sponsored programs. We now know that you can't run jails, public utilities, for profit. We know what the outcome is. They become devastatingly, they become everything that Foucault wrote about and feared as soon as they become, it's bad enough when the government runs them, much worse when they're private practice. So that would be one perspective. Second perspective, what I've noticed about the discourse in English in North America especially is that when you ask these questions, you never know who's gonna show up. So I'm saying to a friend of mine who's an American transplant here in Montreal, a fellow psychiatrist, we're at the APA together, and I'm saying, but she's for Clinton. I said, yeah, but we had a better alternative. This is years back now. We had a better alternative. We had this guy called Saunders. He's our next door neighbor from Vermont. Let's take a look at what he's. She said, oh no, he won't get elected anyway. That was her justification for working with Hillary. So when I say you don't know who's going to show up, is it so she's playing the role of pragmatist. So I'm talking political philosophy or pragmatics, and she's saying, or political philosophy mostly, in my analysis of that. And her answer was pragmatic. So she's this pragmatist. Suddenly, instead of saying, yes, Bernie Sanders is the right guy, but but he won't get elected. Well, that was not so obvious. He might have gotten elected. I think he would have beat Trump. Hillary Clinton may be the only person that Trump could possibly have beaten. So when you talk to people in English in North America, you're not sure if it's a pragmatist, a pundit, a political philosopher, or who's going to show up. So the problem is that people, it's like whack-a-mole or a shell game. You never know what argument you're going to face. So I tend to want to talk political philosophy and the vision we have of society. Because yeah, but Bernie Sanders can't get elected. Yeah, but the new left in Canada, the new Democratic Party can't get elected. So you never know if you're talking principles, if you're talking about social justice, if you're talking more pragmatics, and it's a shell game. And I see this on the front pages and the opinion pages of all the major newspapers, whether it's the Globe and Mail in Toronto, the LA Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and so on and so on. And I always compare it to the other ones like the Wall Street Journal or, El País in Spanish or Le Monde in French. And it's always this shell game. What is the right analysis? So I think the analysis you're proposing is correct. I think we've abandoned and allowed to be stigmatized a huge chunk of the population. Mm. And I think you're right. The answer is not in identity politics, not in a further cleaving, or segmentation of society. The last thing I want to say about, the last approach I would use is, I think that in my lifetime, and certainly in my field, what's happened is the social became replaced. Everything social became replaced in psychiatry, certainly, and in all the side disciplines, and to some extent, the culture at large for those of us who participate in intellectual things, the readers of, the New Yorker and the New York Times literary review and so on, review of books and so on. I think that everything social became replaced by culture. And I'm writing about that.
And the market. And the market. Right? The market.
Yeah, but that has become weaponized or capitalized to the market. So everything is saleable. So we're putting together a World Congress of Social Psychiatry in Brazil right now, and I have a friend, Olga, whose father died in the Spanish Civil War. So she was Spanish. He took his family out of the Spanish Civil War for protection. She was born in Paris, so she grew up speaking French and Spanish. After he was murdered, he went back for one final mission. He was assassinated. He was killed in this. And then she moved to Brazil and was raised in southern Brazil. So I'm happy. This is a daughter of the left, just like I'm a son of the left. My father was secretary of the Socialist International, went to South America to build up socialism there. So we have this common heritage. So we're talking about Black Lives Matter. And she said, and I know this is going to be controversial, but she says, we understand the discourse, but to some extent, it's just a way of creating another market. Does it really speak to needs? Is it authentic? Does it speak to reality? And I remember reading an article in the New York Times, and I'm ashamed I don't remember the name of this woman, but one of the founders or one of the key thinkers in Black Lives Matter said, we see that there's white people, in the parade with us, but we hope they'll stay. And I think that's what's wrong with marketing, weaponizing in the market these ideas. To simplify, and I'm writing an article on this. I hope we'll have broad, traction. I think that's what happened is much of our culture today has gone towards culture as a centrifugal force. I mean, it's splitting people into identities that are incompatible at worst and kind of almost impermeable one to the other in the middle. And at best, they're simply tolerating each other as opposed to coming together. So you can't be this kind of person representing that kind of person in film. You can't appropriate other people's history and so on. The story of humanities appropriation. I mean, right. I don't know how we can get around that. So the other force that I'm for is a centripetal force to recapture the commons, to recapture that working class, the Rust Belt, and all of these other polities that were either ignored or discounted or devalued or disqualified. So how can we create that? And I think that in my life and in my world, the people that I interact with, they privilege culture as if somehow this is a wonderful thing. They do a lot of preening, value preening and self-justification. It's very selective. And at the same time, they don't see that it has this centrifugal force. A centrifuge spins and it pushes things out to the periphery. There is value in diversity, of course. I was at Harvard and I felt stigmatized, and I'm white, supposedly, whatever that means. And I speak English well, and I felt I didn't have my place at Harvard. So of course, I feel for people who are historically stigmatized and excluded and discriminated against. Of course, we should care about that. But should we do it in a way that creates greater barriers and greater communities, ghettoization, as opposed to bringing us together? I think those are the stakes right now for psychiatry. Yeah, and that's why I'm a social psychiatrist, and that's why I'm putting my eggs in that basket. And I think that is emancipatory. You asked me a question, in a private conversation. What's emancipatory about psychiatry? What's emancipatory about psychiatry is to uncouple ourselves from the capitalist machine. I understand that pharmaceutical companies have their role. We need to be pragmatic, but so we can't as Slavoj Žižek says, we don't have an alternative to capitalism, but we need to put it on a leash like Canada did. Canada's history is that for much of our history, at least in my lifetime, last 100 years, maybe less, from the beginning of the New Left and the creation of the New Democratic Party, we had three major forces. It's changing. But in my lifetime, I had three major forces. We had the liberals, which were the solid center. We had the conservatives, which are like your Republicans, but more like Nelson Rockefeller Republicans. Like we call them red Tories, like more socialistically conservative people. For example, they would be fiscally conservative and socially progressive. That was the mantra. And on the other side, you had the New Democratic Party, which was an outcome of the New Left. In which one of my first major mentors in philosophy, Charles Taylor from near Montreal, was very, very involved after he came back from Oxford and doing his PhD with Isaiah Berlin. So he was one of the founders of that movement here in Canada. So we had a balance for a time where David Lewis and the leader of the NDP was called the conscience of the House of Parliament, in which even the conservatives stole his good ideas. So what they did was they co-opted, in a good sense of that Marxist term, the best ideas from David Lewis and the NDP, and then mainstream them to the Liberal Party, which had greater reach. And sometimes the balance would be between the conservatives and the liberals, and they would take turns. But none of them were, the range was like that. The center was large, and the margins were like 20% of the whole thing. And now it's expanded hugely so that Nixon would be a liberal in America.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Nixon opened the Environmental Protection Agency. Kennedy would not be, a Bernie Sanders or an
a communist. Yeah, right.
I mean, things have changed. So in Canada, anyway, at least until recently, now we have other parties like the Greens and so on. We had a rather narrow spectrum, and they informed each other, and there was genuine compromise and haggling, and it came out for the social good. Is that a map for the world? Can that work for the world? Can it work for Canada? Never mind the world. So that would be my hope, to have a more centripetal force based on the social, on the commons, on a shared identity, as opposed to hiving off into different identities where I can never speak for anybody else but Italians from central Italy. So I said to my friend, who's a famous cultural psychiatrist, I said, so So you trained me. I mean, we write in the same journals. We had the same discourse. But what if I became psychotic? How would you treat me in the emergency room? Would you talk to me in my Abruzzo dialect? I said, well, you've been through other socializations. I said, yes, but in my psychosis, I'm going to revert to my childhood language. Are you going to treat me? I mean, of course, we both agree. I'm no longer that little boy that was raised in the Abruzzo. You know, I speak English and French and Portuguese and so on. But we don't allow for that. We stick people. If I don't want to be in a cultural category, what am I? Italian? Am I Jewish? Am I Canadian? Am I Brazilian? What am I? If I'm not comfortable with reducing myself to these categories, why should Native peoples, descendants of the slaves, accept that? Why should we accept prejudices about Italians, about the Irish, about supposed white people, about, you know, my wife is from Brazil. If she was living in the United States, she would be called a Latinx, right?
Right.
Doesn't identify with that at all.
Right.
Maybe for bad reasons. Maybe because she doesn't want to identify with all of South America. But she barely identifies with Brazil because she's from Southern Brazil. She's a Gaúcha. Never mind all of South America. And you know what? It's a huge place. It's many, many cultures, two major languages. So insisting on separate identities where people can't identify with each other has, I think, terrible consequences. We need to recapture the commons. We need to recapture a centripetal vision of society while respecting diversity, but not at the price of having nothing in common anymore. That would be a vento psychiatry for me. That would be a psychiatry based on an understanding that I've gone through a personal emancipation that reconstructs or convenes for the first time a genuine subjectivity based on the multiple. But how do we translate that into clinical practice? That's my project right now.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Well, my friend, this has been quite a number of very enlightening threads that we have had the chance to open up here. I feel like we've only touched it. I feel like we've just begun. So, you know, as when we were in person, and I hope I can see you again in person soon, we would spend hours talking like this. So it's really nice to invite others in, as it were, to listen to these threads. And this conversation has been a blessing for me to have you on the program, Vincenzo. For listeners, Vincenzo's written a very interesting manifesto on slow thought. So even though our conversation has been at a very high pace, a very high level, check out the very interesting, and you can say how to find that article. It's very interesting. And so if you could mention that, and if you could also mention any other future work that you think listeners might like to know about, we can conclude with that, please.
It's very kind. It's always wonderful to be with you. Daniel and I have had a warm and intense sometimes debate about these issues, and I've learned enormously from him. We share many things in common. Certainly, I look forward to being with you in DC again. So yes, I speak quickly and I think quickly. And so many of my friends have pointed out, it's kind of funny, Vincenzo, you're talking about slow thought. You're not a kind of slow person, but slow does not just mean pace. Slow means a different way of thinking. So people can access my slow thought manifesto in Eon magazine online. And it caught a lot of fire. It was translated into Italian, it was translated into Portuguese, and it's also available in other languages. And I'm now negotiating with the publisher to do there's 2 volumes going to come out. One is in Italy, where a series of scholars have been invited to comment on the translation of my essay into Italian, you know, from journalists to philosophers and anthropologists, and certainly therapists. And another one I'm preparing in English is an expanded volume on that. Another manifesto I wrote is a social psychiatry manifesto, in which I tried to bring together the history of social psychiatry into a more cohesive 21st century movement, which would be part of what I would call slow psychiatry. So slow does not only mean slowing down in the literal sense, it also means rethinking the basis for what we're doing. So a slow therapy would be very different than a quick therapy. I think that fundamentally a Lacanian therapy is compatible with what I would call slow therapy, slow psychology, slow psychiatry, because it takes time, it attends to details, and it tends to want to slow things down. My last book is called Psychiatry in Crisis at the Crossroads of Social Science the humanities and neuroscience. And it is a plea for staying in the field, validating psychiatry, but with a greatly expanded base, and not to allow ourselves to collapse into a series of single message mythologies, psychopharmacology, social psychiatry, family therapy, the community revolution, and so on. We need to have more syntheses. We need to have more centripetal unifying thought. That will be my plea. The other thing that I'm working on is I'm writing an article that I call Terms of the Social. It was inspired by Roberto Esposito's book, Terms of the Political. So I want to do for the field of psychiatry, notably for social psychiatry or an emancipatory psychiatry, if you wish, what Roberto Esposito tried to do in political thought. So Terms of the Social would be my way of bringing together a lot of the threads of what we discussed today, Ronnie Lang's social phenomenology. What do we mean by the social in general? How do we redefine society? And I would urge readers to look up an old British leftist called Raymond Williams, who wrote a beautiful book called Keywords that also was updated. It's a sort of an ongoing updated project, but his initial 2 editions are very interesting to read because he does a very, very informed reading of the vocabulary of society. In other words, when we use a word like development, family, culture, what are the roots of that? And he tracks through in English and in other European languages the roots of these notions. In a sense, this is what I want to do with this article that perhaps may become a book called Terms of the Social. How can we recapture the language of the social, notably for the left, however we conceive of this broad group, and how can we recapture those very areas that we've abandoned, the left has abandoned, the working class, in many ways the family, which Daniel Tutt has written about in his forthcoming book, Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family. So how can we recapture that discourse in a congruent and cohesive way so that we can get back in the middle, we can get back to the public discourse, because not only in psychiatry, but I think in the public forum, leftists have either been or ostracized, become ostracized, and they've been conniving in this exclusion from the public debate. When Hillary Clinton talks about people being deplorable, this is not the language of the left. This is not a left I can possibly agree with. Right. We don't call people deplorable. That's my plea, and those are my projects.
Beautiful. On that note, we thank you for being with us on this program, and you'll have to come back. We'd love to continue to maybe do something on the slow thought, or even a conversation on the family, which we both share a profound interest in. So have a wonderful holiday season, a wonderful new year, and we'll be excited to be sharing this with everyone. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and happy holidays to everybody. And let's hope for a better new year in 2022, and health and harmony and happiness if we can get it.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.